Dear students, welcome back to the fifth recorded lecture of Principles of Economics course. And in this lecture, we will explain the second part of chapter 3. As we have seen last week, this chapter is entitled as Demand and Supply, which means that we discuss the market forces and how the interaction between the demand and supply determines the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. Last week we explained the definition of markets and the competitive market, and we have also covered the first side of the market, which is the demand, where we define the demand and the law of demand that shows the negative relationship between the quantity demanded of a good and its price. We have also covered the determinants of demand. Now, what are the main learning objectives of this lecture? In this lecture, we will cover the second side of the market, which is the supply. So we will define supply and explain the factors that lead to a decrease or an increase in the supply. Also, we will explain the difference between a change in the quantity supplied and a change in the supply. In the interactive lecture, we will continue this chapter and explain the market equilibrium and explain how we can predict the future prices based on the changes in the demand and supply. So let's start with the first point in this lecture, which is the meaning of supply. If the firm supplies something, this means that the firm must satisfy the following conditions. First, it must have the resources and the technology to produce it, and second, it can achieve some profits from producing this good, and the third condition, it must have made a definite plan to produce and to sell this product. So this means that the resources and the technology is a key factor that determine what is possible to produce. Then, if the firm produces the commodity, this means that the firm must have the required technology and resources, which implies that supply reflects a decision about what is technologically feasible items to produce. Then, what is the quantity supplied of the commodity or the service? We can define the quantity supplied of a good or service as the amount that producers plan to sell during a given time period at a given or particular price. And this means that the quantity supplied may be higher than the quantity actually sold in markets. How can we explain this sentence? Sometimes the quantity supplied in the market is higher than the amount that consumers are willing to buy, which means that the quantity that people will purchase will be lower than the amount that firms plan to sell at the given price. Also, as we measure the quantity demanded per unit of time, here we measure the quantity supplied per unit of time. For example, the firm may plan to sell 10 units of a commodity each day. So this means that the quantity supplied of the commodity is 10 units per day or 300 units each month, and so on. Now, to explain the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, we use the law of supply, which states that other things remaining the same, the higher the price of the good, the greater is the quantity supplied, and the lower the price of the good, the smaller is the quantity supplied. So, we can conclude that there is a positive relationship between the quantity supplied of a good and its price, so they move in the same direction. Now, the question is, why does a higher price encourage producers to increase the quantity supplied? The law of supply results from the general tendency for the marginal cost of producing a good or service to increase as the quantity produced increase. Based on that, producers are willing to supply a good only if they can at least cover their marginal cost of production. For example, Suppose that the price of a cup of coffee is $5, then producers will produce an additional cup of coffee only if the marginal cost of the new cup is at least $5. As in the case of the demand, we can express the relationship between the quantity supplied and the price using supply curve and supply schedule, but here we will focus on the supply curve, where the word supply refers to the entire relationship between the price of the good and the quantity supplied of this good, when all other factors on producers' plans remain the same. So, as we can see, the supply curve slopes upward to express the positive relationship between the quantity supplied and the price of the good. So it shows us the quantity supplied at different prices. For example, as we can see in the figure, if the price of the good is $0.50 at point A, here the quantity supplied is 0 units per week. So we can conclude that this price doesn't cover the marginal cost of production. Now, when the price increases to be $1 at point B, then the quantity supplied increases to become 5 million units per week, and so on. So, based on that, we can see on this curve that a rise in the price when other things remains the same will lead to an increase in the quantity supplied, and we should move up along the supply curve. On the other hand, a fall in price, say from $1.5 to $1, brings a decrease in the quantity supplied from 15 to 10, no, not 15 to 10, it's from 11 to 8 million per week. So, as I said, a fall in price will lead to a decrease in the quantity supplied, and we will move down along the supply curve. And of course, as before, we assume that all other factors are constant. Now, let's move to the next point, which is the factors that affect the supply and that will lead to a shift of the entire supply curve to the right or to the left. Well, when there is no a change in the price of the good, but there are some changes that affect on selling plans other than the price, we say that there is a change in the supply of that good. This means that the quantity of the good that producers plan to sell will change at each and every single price. So we will have a new supply curve. And here we have to distinguish between two cases: when supply increases and when supply decreases. When supply increases, the supply curve will shift to the right, and when supply decreases, the supply curve shifts to the left. But what are the factors that will lead to these changes in the supply? Generally, we have 6 factors that may lead to a change in the supply curve, which are prices of factors of production, prices of related goods, number of suppliers, expected future prices, technology, and state of nature. Let's start with the first factor that will lead to a change in the supply curve, and this factor is the prices of related goods produced. And here we should distinguish between two related goods, which are substitute in production and complementary in production. And what is the meaning of a substitute in production? It means that another good that can be produced using the same resources, such as, for example, if we have a plot of agricultural land, then we can use it to produce many substitute crops, such as corn, wheat, or rice. Another example is that if we have another plot of land that can be used for building real estate properties, then we can use it to build multifamily flats or single family houses. Also, a car firm can use their resources to produce four-door sedans or pickup trucks. So here, a higher price of the substitute means that producers will increase the supply of the substitute, and the supply of the commodity or the other commodity will decrease. For example, if the price of a corn increases, this means that producers will produce more corn, which means that the production of other crops such as rice will decrease. So based on that, we can see that there is a negative relationship between the supply of a good and the price of substitute in production. On the other hand, complementary in production means goods that are produced together. For example, we have complement in production such as wheat and hay. Also, we have another example which is beef and cowhide. So, the higher the price of the complementary means that producers will increase the supply of this complementary, and of course, the production of the other good will increase as well. For example, if the price of beef increases, then producers will produce more beef, which means that the production of cowhide will increase as well. So here we have a positive relationship between the supply of the good and the price of the complementary. The second factor that will lead to a change in the supply is the prices of factors of production. So if the prices of factors of production used to produce a good increase, then the cost of production increases as well, which will lead to a reduction in the supply. For example, if wages or interest rate increase, then the cost of production of the good will increase, and the supply of this good will decrease, and the supply curve will shift to the left. On the other hand, if wages decrease, then the cost of production will decrease, and in this case, producers can produce more, and the supply curve will shift to the right. Based on that, we can say there is a negative relationship between the prices of factors of production and the supply of the commodity. The third factor is expected future prices, where a rise in the expected future price of a good motivates producers to decrease current production, so the supply curve will shift to the left. On the other hand, if producers expect that price will be lower in the futures, then producers will try to sell more of the commodity now before this decrease in the price occurs, so they will increase current production to sell the commodity at the higher prices and achieve higher revenues. So in this case, the supply curve will shift to the right. Based on that, we can say there is a negative relationship between the supply of a good and this will lead to a decrease in the supply, and supply curve will shift to the left. The fourth factor that will lead to a change in the supply is the number of suppliers, where the larger the number of suppliers of a good, the greater is the supply of this good, and we will have an increase in the supply. In this case, the supply curve will shift to the right. Then the fifth factor is the technology, where introducing new technology creates new products and lowers the cost of producing existing products, and this will lead to an increase in the supply and a shift in the supply curve to the right. For example, if a firm has a traditional machine that produces 10 units per hour, then if there is a new machine that produces 15 units per hour, this will lead to an increase in the production using the same work time. The final factor that affects the supply is the state of nature, which includes all the natural forces that affect the production, such as weather. For example, a natural disaster, such as an earthquake that destroyed the buildings of many factories, will lead to a decrease in the supply and shift the supply curve to the left. Now, the final point in this lecture is the difference between a change in the supply and a change in the quantity supplied. A change in the quantity supplied means that a movement along the same supply curve, and this occurs when the price of the good changes and other factors remain the same. So the quantity supplied it changes and there is a movement along the same supply curve, which is the curve labeled as S0 in this graph. On the other hand, a change in the supply means that there is no change in the price of the good, but there are changes in any of the previous 6 factors that I have just explained. So in this case, if the supply increases, the entire supply curve will move from S0 to the right, and we will have a new supply curve, which is S1. In opposite, if the supply decreases, then the entire supply curve will move from location S0 to the left, and we will have a new supply curve, which is S2. I will stop at this point where we have covered the meaning of supply and explained the differences between the supply and the quantity supplied. We have also explained the law of supply that shows the positive relationship between the quantity supplied of the good and its price. And we also explained the factors that will lead to a change in the entire supply. Thank you for watching and see you next week.